Morning, everyone. Sorry for joining in a bit of a panic there. I actually came into my office today, so it was nice and quiet for having this meeting, but that's not going to be the case. So if the work from outside does get too noisy, people can just tell me. Let me know. So just wanted to welcome everyone today to the meeting. We've got our members meeting first, which is quite packed and got lots of speakers. And then we're going to have our AGM at the end of the meeting. So I'm actually just going to pass over now to Claire, and we're going to have a little chat, or Claire's going to fill us in on our key messages for our engagement events.
Thanks very much, Kimberly. That's great. I'm going to share my screen with everybody. Can everybody see that okay? Okay. So what I'm going to attempt to do with this presentation is bring together all the messages that we've had around the consultation on the National Care Service. I think most people know now that this consultation has been going on since just the beginning of August, and it closes on the 2nd of November. So it's a really ambitious programme which the Scottish Government has put forward, and it's based on the independent review of social care, which was undertaken by Derek Feely. So a lot of you might know about it as the Feely Report. And it looks at a radical overhaul of how we deliver social care in Scotland. And it's something which I think it's an interesting time that it's come out. Obviously, it's come out of the pandemic, with people realising the deficits in social care really being enhanced by what's happened since the pandemic started. So in response to that, the government, like I say, undertook the review, and following the review, they've set out their proposals in terms of reforming social care. So what we've done is we've had various engagement and consultation events, we've had surveys, and we've spoken to a lot of carers and also staff who work with carers to get their views on what should happen with social care. And some of what we've done, we've based on the Scottish Government questions, but actually we've gone beyond that as well. So the Scottish Government consultation was mostly kind of based on structures and processes, whereas Feely was a lot more kind of focused on human rights and principles. So what we've done in our meetings is we've done both actually. We've looked at the proposals and asked people's opinions, but we've gone beyond that and said, you know, we need to look at social care in a different way, and it's not just about those structures and processes. So what I'm aiming to do today is I've pulled together the key messages, and my aim is to present them to you and then ask for your views on it. So I'm basically asking you to endorse them if you think they're right, add to them if you think there's things that are missing, and if there's anything you don't agree with, to let us know, so that when we put in our submission, we can be confident that we're representing our carers and members. So what we've been up to since August, we've facilitated 15 different engagement events. 9 were with other organisations, and those organisations will be putting in their own submissions. So what we did in those occasions was we just kind of provided information and an overview for them. 10 of the engagement sessions were with carers, and 5 were with groups of staff. And some of them were with very specific groups. So for example, we have a mental health carers group, we have a rural group, and we have a kind of the carer reps on integrated joint boards. So some of them came from a very specific perspective, which was really useful. And then the largest piece of work we did in terms of gathering views were our 2 surveys. So we did a survey specifically on the right to breaks from caring, which was part of the government consultation, and we got nearly 1,000 responses. And we also did one specifically on the National Care Service, and we got 424 responses. So a really good volume of information came in, and I'm going to talk you through some of the things that people said in those surveys. So in terms of the rights to breaks from caring, we asked a few polling questions, and then people commented as well. Now it's quite complicated. If you've read the paper or you've had the chance to get involved in one of the discussions, you'll have been given a wee bit more background to this. But what the government's done is it's set out a range of options for delivering on our right to short breaks. And one of the questions they were asking is, should all carers have a right to a short break, or should it only be carers with a more intensive caring role? So that's one of the questions we asked. And as you'll see, the majority of people, so about 80%, said it should be all carers. And then with about 14% saying only carers with a more intensive role. When we had discussion groups around this, there was a lot of debate about it. You know, if, for example, you provide all carers with a short break, will it mean that they get, it's spread too thinly? Versus people saying, well, if carers need a break, all carers should get a break. So that was kind of the crux of the argument. What's interesting is that whenever we had the same discussion with staff, it was more mixed. It was more half and half, with more saying that it should only be carers with a more intensive caring role to direct resources towards them. So what you'll find as I go through this, there isn't one answer. There's often, it's often quite complicated with a lot of different things that need to be weighed up. We also asked the question, how should the amount of respite a carer receives be decided? And these roughly follow the options given by the Scottish Government, but they're a bit simplified. So all carers be entitled to the same amount of respite? Should it be decided on an individual basis depending on the needs of the carer? Should it be on a scale so that carers with a more intensive role receive more respite with the amount clearly set out, or not sure? And you'll see from that there was a real mix in terms of what people thought, with a slight majority going to what we call our hybrid approach, which is all carers should get a minimum entitlement, with carers who have a more intensive caring role receiving an additional amount. And whenever we looked at the results from our discussion groups, this option was actually a lot more popular, with about 80% of carers and staff saying that was the option they'd go for. And I think that's because it provides some kind of balance in terms of all carers who need it would get something, but some carers who are maybe caring for 24 hours or have their own health problems for various reasons, they might need more support, would get an additional amount. So that seems to be the one that's favoured and the one that we will be putting forward in our submission, although obviously with weighing up the pros and cons that people also put forward in their comments. Another question we asked, which actually wasn't asked in the government consultation, is how should people receive a respite allocation if they have a right to it? Should it be a payment? Should it be an allocation of respite hours? Should it be respite weeks, or not sure? And as you see again, if you look at the hours and the weeks together, it is not far off half and half. So again, not a simple thing. So I think what we've concluded from that is that people should have the choice, a bit like SDS itself, self-directed support. It should be up to the carer how they take any right to respite. I'm now going to move on to some of the messages that we got from the survey on short breaks. And what I've done with each of these, I've put quotes in as well. I'm not going to read out the quotes, but you can have a look at them as I'm talking, because some of them are really powerful. The top message from people, 110 carers responded saying there needs to be a mix of respite options, providing adequate provision and catering for different needs. And the way that was reflected in the comments was carers saying, well, I find it really hard to get respite that works for me. This is what I need. So a lot of parent carers, for example, saying they found it really hard, particularly whenever the person they looked after perhaps had behavioural issues or found it difficult to go and go to a venue outside the home, for example, or be provided with respite from somebody they didn't know. So lots of comments around that, lots of comments from people in rural areas saying they struggled to get a short break, etc. So I think the very clear conclusion is, for the right to respite to work, there needs to be a good range of options. I mean, you almost need a specific option for every carer, or at least the ability for them to choose what they want, because people's circumstances are so different. The other major theme that came out was people basically saying that social care is inadequate and doesn't meet people's needs. I mean, in a nutshell, people were saying the system is broken at the moment, and they've not been able to access support. And I think it's really important that we have this message in our submission. I think it's one that obviously they know, because that's why they did the review in the first place. But, people were saying you can't build on, for example, a right to a break when there isn't a foundation there. So we need to look at the whole system, things like the workforce, which we'll go on to talk about later, things like, commissioning, in order to make sure that we could have a right to a short break for carers. So looking at the system as a whole is really important. 43 carers said the breaks need to be regular and consistent. A lot of people said they had been able to get one-off breaks or breaks in an emergency, but what they needed was to know how much they were getting and when they were getting it so they could rely on that regular break. And I mean, that's the same for everyone. It's something that Feely said when he was talking to carers groups as well, that you need regular breaks just as a human being, never mind as a carer. So it needs to be something that you can rely on. And a lot of carers unfortunately said that they were exhausted and at breaking point, that they had been struggling before the pandemic, but unfortunately since services stopped or were reduced since the pandemic, they're really struggling. And I think a lot of those messages were really powerful and also difficult to read. We know how difficult it is for carers from all the meetings we've had and so on, but I think that although the message is getting across to government to a degree, I don't think they realise the extent of it. So it's something that we really need to make sure they're aware of. So then we also looked at the National Care Service. This was our second survey. And in a very broad kind of way, do you think it's a good idea to set up a National Care Service? As you can see, just over half of people said yes, I think it's a good idea. A kind of fair proportion said no, so that was about just less than a quarter, and then quite a lot of people said I don't know. What we found when we were able to discuss it with people in the engagement events was there was a lot of kind of concerns about it, a lot of people saying I need to know more, I don't know how this is going to work, it's difficult to say. But when it came to the polling, quite often they said yes. So I would say in summary, what people are saying, the majority of carers are saying yes with caveats. Yes, but we need to know more information about this. Yes, but I'm not sure how it will work. So unless the principles are right, I don't think people are supportive, but the majority in the end would say yes, they do think something like this is needed to radically change things. We asked about what reach the National Care Service should have, because the Scottish Government's proposals went way beyond the Feely report. The Feely report only looked at adult social care, but the government has looked at children's services, alcohol and drug services and mental health services, to name a few, going into the National Care Service. As you see, again, the majority of people said yes, but in conversation, people again said, well, yes, if. So for example, with children's services, most parent carers or people looking after, who had been looking after children who were now adults, were saying yes if it helps with transitions and makes that easier, because that's a really difficult time, but no if it means that children's services might get subsumed with adult services, and a lot of people saying they got a better service with children's services. So if they were to kind of be taken together, they would be concerned about the standard lowering in children's services. So again, yes, but with caveats. And again, the messages coming through from the comments, we got a lot of comments, about 200 odd comments from the survey as well. So 55% of carers said they would prefer that responsibility for social care shift to national government, and there was a range of reasons for that. A lot of people saying that they wanted more accountability and they felt this would deliver on that. Some people saying that they thought it would lead to greater consistency and end the postcode lottery. Other people saying that they'd been let down by the local authority. Other people saying they thought it would drive up standards. So lots of reasons for that. But as you see with the poll, certainly it was the majority that said they would rather shift to this model. But then equally quite a lot of people saying that no, they wanted the responsibility to stay with local authorities. And a lot of the reasons around that were almost the same but the opposite to the government. A lot of people saying that they wanted decisions made locally and as close to the community as possible. That was a big one. Some people saying they didn't trust the government to take it on and be responsible for such a big programme. Other people saying the reach was too far and it was too much to bite off. And a lot of people saying they just didn't know because there wasn't enough information on it. So again, a mix of opinions. Other messages around both the surveys, a big one, and I think one that really is important to take on is people said they wanted the process for accessing a break to be simple, fair and transparent. If it is a bureaucratic process, a lot of carers said that they wouldn't want to go through it. And one person even saying that they felt quite traumatised by the amount of assessments they had been through and they wouldn't want to go through another one. So something universal which doesn't require a lot of application, a lot of kind of bureaucracy, and something fair and transparent. Some people said that they hadn't accessed a short break because they felt guilty, but if there was a right, then they would access it. And they felt it would have a positive effect on their health and well-being. So it might change the dynamics in terms of carers accessing a break. A lot of people saying it has to be free. You can't charge for this. It shouldn't be linked to things like carers allowance. So we need to think about that as well. And actually, I don't think the proposal was to link it to carers allowance, but it's an important point to make anyway. And lots around specific groups that need to be considered. So working carers, carers from BME communities, young carers and carers from rural areas, just to name a few. With the National Care Service, you won't be surprised to know a big thing which a lot of people commented on was it needs adequate funding. In fact, some people saying it doesn't matter who delivers it, we just need more funding. So funding was absolutely critical. Carers must be equal partners throughout the whole process, otherwise their views won't be taken into account, it won't work. And this thing, which I think kind of sums it up, this balance between centralisation on the one hand, but localism and local decision making on the other. So with all that, with so much information which carers are very kindly given us around social care, we wanted to go back to principles. We wanted to go back to looking at actually rather than sort of answering the questions of the government, what do we want a social care system to look like? So what we've done is we've split it into 4 areas and we've pulled together principles on this for the submission. So first of all, the principles around the purpose and value of social care, and we are going to talk about this a bit later as well, but the person must be at the centre, and the principles of independent living and self-directed support must be at the heart of any future health and social care support. It can't be about deficits, it must be about independent living and having the person at the centre. Human rights, like I say, Feely was all about human rights, and not just the human rights of people who are using social care, but also of carers, supporting carers so that they can retain their human rights as well and have a life alongside caring. A key thing is how you determine need or how you decide who gets support. At the minute, it is all about risk and eligibility criteria, but so it shouldn't be about resources being determined by need. Instead, it's about need being determined by resources. And that's the way the health service works effectively. So it's not a case of, I'm sorry, there's been too many broken legs this month, so we can't actually fix yours. It's about the resources are there to meet the need, and that's the way we need to look at social care as well. So eligibility criteria, we believe, should be removed, and there should be more of a preventative approach. So in terms of carers then, back to principles with carers, key is carers being viewed as equal partners in care and providers of care rather than users of services. And when we talk about it in those terms, then it makes sense to say that carers, like the paid care workforce, require the resources to support them in their caring role, and protection to have a life outside of caring. It reframes things. It says that, it's not about giving carers some support, it's saying carers are providers and they need that to protect their health and well-being, like the paid workforce. All carers, the kind of short breaks is complicated how you deliver it, but there are 2 principles I think we need to absolutely retain, which is all carers who require a break should be able to access one, and carers must have choice and control in relation to the break, and it has to be a positive experience for themselves and the person they care for. So that has to be there before the right is, that marketplace has to be there. And finally, carers have to have access to trainings to support them in their caring role as well, for things like moving and handling and managing medication, etc. So all social care recipients, the principles around that, firstly, people need to know their rights, and if they aren't able to attain their rights, have right to rapid recourse and redress. The Scottish Government proposals around complaints are slightly weak and I think need strengthening, and this was something which was very strong in Feely, that those two things are absolutely necessary for the social care system to work. The needs of rural and island communities have to be given specific consideration, and there's been lots of concerns around centralisation with the National Care Service and how that will work for island communities which are so much further away. The needs of BME communities as well, in the same way that the services need to be responsive to their needs. Social care must be universal and free to all. Kind of ending charges wasn't part of the Scottish Government consultation, but it is a commitment within their manifesto, so it's important that that's delivered. And good transitions as well from child to adult services have to be integral. So finally, the system overall, whatever the system is, whatever the process is, it should be as simple as possible, fair and transparent. And that, I think, needs to be put across very strongly. It's about trust. For example, one of the reasons why SDS hasn't worked the way it should do, I think, is because of not trusting people to decide what's best for themselves and letting them get on with it. So I think that's what we really want to see the system move on to do, to trust people, to know what is right for them in terms of the care they receive. The focus must be on outcomes and not impact, and like I say, localism can't be lost to centralisation. Decisions have to be as close to the person and the community as possible. It needs to be, instead of top down, bottom up, it needs to be carers and people in their communities deciding what works for them. With, you know, maybe a national structure looking at principles and standards, but decisions need to be made locally. And any new legislation must be fully funded and implemented. We've had legislation which is really good in the past, which hasn't been fully funded or implemented. So let's not make that mistake again. So that is a quick run through what I've been hearing from people and trying to summarise it and put it into principles. And later on, we're going to be discussing it and voting on it to get your views.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks. I just wanted to say, sorry, I should have said to everyone that we're going to have some time for discussion and polls. We're just going to welcome Marion and Shabana. They're both carers, but they both sit on the Social Covenant Oversight Group. So they're going to give us their views on social care and their support for carers.
Hi,
Marion,
Kimberly.
thank you.
Sorry, just a slight change because Shabana is off this week. So I'm going to introduce Marion and then sort of take her through it, if that's okay.
Yeah, sorry.
So sorry about that. So I've just been spending a lot of time telling you about how things are at the moment and what people's lives are like, and you know, quite a few difficult stories in terms of what social care is like for people at the moment. And I think we need to always keep in mind and have a strong message that it doesn't need to be like that. You know, we can have radical change, we can be ambitious in what our aims for social care are. And in Scotland, there are some really good examples of where it works. Unfortunately, it is not consistent, it's not everybody. But there are examples where people have managed to carve out a really good service for themselves. And I'm really pleased that Marion McCardle's here because she's one of these people who has managed to get a service which works for her and her daughter Laura. So what I'm going to do is I've got a couple of questions to ask. We're going to do it like an interview. So I'm going to ask Marion some questions and she's going to talk you through how she managed to get there and how it works for her and Laura. So Marion, first of all, I was just going to ask you, what's life like for you and Laura now?
Okay, well, Laura, life is good, Claire. Certainly much better than it was before we got this individualised budget and support for Laura. And so how we live at the moment, we were lucky enough to build an extension onto our home. And that's where, like a kind of granny flat type of idea, and that's where Laura lives. And she has her own front door and all that. So it kind of gives her a feeling of independence, but at the same time, be with her, beside her family. And that's because that's what suits Laura. I understand that if I was to describe Laura's life and her life, I know that isn't what everybody. In fact, there might not be anyone else that would choose that, but the important thing is it's what suits Laura and us, and this works really, really well. So Laura gets enough self-directed support to employ support workers to cover 24/7 period. So that's just great, and it means that then I can then become Laura's mum rather than mum carer, and you know, her dad. It's nice, she gets the good part of having parents that aren't jiggered and exhausted all the time, and it's really worked out really well. But I think it's worked out really well because from day one, the focus has always been on this is what we think is right for Laura. Laura would find that difficult to tell us, but you know, we know her really well and we have to guess at a lot of things. Laura was born with Down syndrome, and then when she was a year old, she suffered severe brain damage during a heart operation. So she has really quite profound and complex needs. So it'd be very difficult for Laura to communicate effectively and all sorts of health problems and things that she has. But despite all these needs, she has a lovely life, and she has choice, real control. All the buzzwords, she has all that every single day in her life. So every day is about what do we think or what do our support workers think that Laura would be like to do just now. What does she need to do? Unfortunately, a lot of Laura's needs are health needs, and we have to respect that. We have to look after her health needs, but we managed to do that quite insignificantly. Just throughout her day, the health needs are met while she's having a life and a good life, and she's never been happier or healthier in her life. So we saw that change almost immediately once we changed from Laura using services to having this individual support. We started to see huge changes in her health and her happiness. So life is good. It's good.
Thanks, Maria. It's lovely to hear that, actually, that you've managed to get the services that suit you and suit particularly Laura. How did you get there? Was it a difficult journey to sort of set it all up?
Yeah. I got there. I suppose it started to get there when we were introduced to advocacy services, and we were offered to have Laura could have this advocate worker. And I thought, oh, wonderful, somebody else that can be asking for things on Laura's behalf. You know, sometimes often when I felt I was asking for something for Laura, I felt like the person I was asking, say it was a social worker, I felt they were thinking, does Marion want this for her daughter, or does she want it for herself? So if I was asking for Laura to have play in her life, you know, it used to be just school and then home and nothing. And I just wanted Laura to have some social interaction with her peers, some play, things that we know are basic human rights. And they couldn't find anything for Laura. It's interesting that the only thing they could offer us an answer to that was a respite break. So they would take money from a respite budget for us. So in order to meet Laura's needs, they couldn't really do that. So we'll look at the carers' needs. Well, I'd much rather it was all about Laura, you know, and if you do that, then in turn, you're going to look after my needs. So that's, so previously life was, so when this advocate, I just thought that's great. She'll be able to ask for things without that dilemma. And at that time, Laura was going to two different day services, Monday to Friday. And her needs were, I knew she was never meeting her full potential there. They didn't have the time or resources or anything like that. And Laura's life was really fitting into the needs of these services. Absolutely. Her life was timetabled. Even issues like personal care was timetabled into her day. It was timetabled when she would come out of her chair. And the activity she got up to was never what Laura would choose, because Laura didn't have that voice. She was never a majority, she was always a minority. So her life was never really about what Laura would actually choose. So this advocate worker, I thought, you can help me. She introduced me to an idea called personalisation. And I went along to Enable. We're having a conference about this new buzzword, personalisation. And there I heard the family talking about their son who had direct payments. And I loved, and I was really inspired listening to his story. And I was so inspired to ask that. They came from Cheshire, and I asked, could I come along and visit them at home to see how this worked? I won't describe it all to you, but that was really, I then came home from that and went to my local authority and says, I would love an individual budget for Laura. I know this would work for her. I know this is what she needs. But Claire, it took, I would say, about 2 years of going to meetings and asking and never been told no, because they really couldn't say no, because what I was asking for was what we would class as basic human needs and rights. But in my mind, I was asking for a life. I knew what she needed and I knew she wasn't getting it. And please, could we have this? So, and I said to them, if you're going to say no to me, then I'll bring Laura. I never took Laura to meetings because she would hate that, but I says, I'll bring Laura and you can tell Laura, no, she can't. She can't have a life like MDL. She can't have any choice in her life. You tell that to Laura then. So, of course, they found it difficult to say no, and they said yes eventually. I don't know how they did it. I have a feeling they pinched money for this budget and pinched money. I don't know, and I don't care. And I said to them, I don't want to know about the money. Just tell me a yes or a no. It's your job to work out any budget involved here. And to this day, I don't know how much is spent in Laura's budget. My husband does and everybody else does, but I like to think of Laura getting this life because she deserves it and because she's entitled to it. So that was how it came about. Was that your question? Sorry, Claire. That was really how it came about.
I think kind of what you're saying, Marion, and it goes back to what a lot of people said in the survey is, you know, they needed to trust you that was, you knew what was right for Laura, and it's worked out that way. How's it been for you then as Laura's mum and her carer as well? What's the change been like from the previous way things worked to now?
How has her life changed? Sorry, Claire, is that what you mean?
How's it changed for you as her mum and her carer?
Right. Well, massively, because I can then, so you've just spent quite a long time talking about respite there. So we no longer have a need for that respite or short breaks, because I could go on holiday whenever I like, or Laura can go on holiday with it. So that's taken out of it. I remember the nightmare days of respite. Absolutely. It was never respite. It was never a break, if that's what a respite is supposed to be about, because Laura's needs were never met. I was worried sick about Laura the whole time. So how is that a break for me? So eventually, well, after about 3 attempts, we said, forget this for a break. That it just isn't going to happen. So just what you were saying, the survey saying, you know, the break needs to be about providing some quality. It needs to be a break that Laura would look forward to. That's what it needs to be, something that you would both look forward to. Otherwise, it's not a break. But so we don't have a need for that. I can see Laura every day, whenever I like, or I can have a break, or it's just lovely being her mum. And I do feel so different going into Laura I'm going like that because I can cuddle her without any feeling. Normally, just looking at Laura before my bones and my muscles were aching, and do you know what I mean? Now I'm not as jiggered, sore or anything like that. So it is ideal. I don't feel like, I do still feel a caring as much as I have that always be in my mind 24/7 and kind of maybe overseeing and making sure everything's okay and everything's going along with exactly what Laura would like, because the focus has to always be on Laura. And I know as a parent, sometimes I can let the focus come off Laura. So anyone else supporting Laura, we just need to keep reminding ourselves, this is absolutely all about Laura. I would say the most difficult part though of this is trusting someone else with my daughter. Mm-hmm. So the hardest job ever was employing people, particularly if I'd never met them before in my life, interviewing strangers, thinking, how are you going to be with my daughter? Can I trust you with my daughter? The most precious you could ever think of would be your son or your daughter. How can I trust? So that was the most difficult part. And I could talk forever about how we got through that. It was hard work, Claire. It wasn't easy. It was a nightmare at times. But I'm glad we stuck with it, because at one point my husband says, right, Marion, you're either going with this, you're not. So I found it very difficult to totally think somebody's going to be dead right. So once we made up our mind, we're definitely going for it. I'm glad we stuck with it. She has a wonderful team now, and of course somebody's going to leave, but I now know there's somebody out there, there are good people out there that Laura would much prefer. And when we started this, I said to everybody, oh, I was just, you can imagine how nervous I was about it. And I said to her team, so if Laura ever asks for mum, she would say Amma for mum. If she ever asks for me, you must come and get me right away. I will always be here. Come and get me right away, so that Laura knows I just need to make that sound and my mum will be here. So that happened occasionally for the first 2 weeks. And then after that, Laura never asks for me. And the opposite happens now. When I go into Laura's pad, as we call it, Laura says bye-bye to me. She wants me away. She absolutely does not want me in there. And at first I found that difficult. But you know, if Laura's no well or anything like that, she'll ask for mum. So I say, oh, she does love me some. But that's a lovely position to be in as well.
It shows how much it's working, doesn't it, Marion?
It shows how, honestly, Claire, if anybody could see it, and I always say to people, come and see. I don't mean the physical side of things, but just how it can work. And I think that's why I'm sticking with this Feely report and sticking with this, and it's good that I'm on the steering group. I welcome that opportunity, because I absolutely believe that it can work for everybody. And it's not going to work the way it works for Laura McArdle, because no two people are the same. So what works for Laura isn't going to be exactly what works. And when I went to see that family in Cheshire, I picked the bits that I thought would work for Laura and wanted to copy them, and then had everything else built around Laura's needs. But it definitely does work, Claire.
I've got a wee question in the chat for you, Marion, and then just a kind of final question myself. But so Carol Ann from North Lanarkshire Carers Together is asking, how did it work in the pandemic? Did it bring problems with your one-to-one support, and was there flexibility with Laura's budget? And then as well, I think I just want to ask you, what message would you give, in terms of reforming social care? So maybe, if you wouldn't mind answering those.
Okay, how did it work through the pandemic? Again, it was a positive story, because if everybody could grasp the idea of every minute, and I know that sounds like you're exaggerating, but every day being about that, focused on that person. So during the pandemic, we were still able to focus on Laura, because yes, we did continue with the budget. We got an email from our local authority. I think it was a kind of general thing that we found somewhere, saying it's up to us as employers whether the PAs would be paid or not, and it's up to us whether they would come into Laura or not. So we thought, that's great. We can continue to pay the PAs, and that means that they still have a job and that they'll still be there when we need them. For the first 5 months, I was too scared to allow any carers to come in. So we asked them not to come in, but they were still paid fully, which was a really good position to be in. And so my husband and I took over all the caring of Laura. And it's strange to say this, I know, because I think back to the days when I was absolutely jiggered, and the thought of just me doing most of it, because Tam was working, the thought of me doing most of all that care 24/7 for 5 months would have been a nightmare. That actually was lovely. And it's because it was lovely because I didn't realise how much I had missed Laura with all these carers been in. And since that 5 months, I've put something in place to make sure that I don't miss Laura so much, and that's another story. But I really enjoyed most of that 5 months, this relationship with just Laura and I again. So that worked for Laura, but it did work for me as well. And then we gradually introduced, because carers were being paid, and respected, then we introduced them back an hour a day, and then we gradually built up, and we sat outside. We opened Laura's back doors so that Laura she was inside the house, they were outside, keeping safe. She heard the wee voices again, singing, and different things went on, and we gradually built it up until they're in full time now. So no, and so Laura's services, not services, she doesn't go to any services, but she goes to different clubs and things. They all closed down during the pandemic, but we're dead lucky again, because Laura's very favourite thing to do above everything else is be in her car. So she was still allowed throughout all that time to be in her car. So twice a day, Laura's out and about in that car and just loves it. So we were able to keep safe from people, keep her distance and things like that.
That's great to hear, Marion. It sounds like you managed to get a solution there which worked for you. And so just a final thing, if you've got one message that or one thing you really want them to change about social care to make a difference so other carers and people like Laura can benefit, what would it be?
Focus on that one, each individual. And there are a lot of individuals in Scotland, whether we're talking about carers or people who need the care, and just keep that focus on the person. You cannot go wrong, and you will save money. Laura's budget must be huge to be paying 24/7 care, but I know for a fact that there's huge cost savings to social work. We never see social work services now. Our health has improved so much. Honestly, there's a cost saving there. Keep the focus on the person. You can't go wrong, and it must be individual. It must be, and I think that all that means is a big change in attitudes, values, and no one person is of any more value than anybody else on this planet. And so if you truly value that one person, you'll get it right if you keep the focus. I think that's the message I would say.
Thanks, Marion. I'm just going to finish with a comment in the kind of chat box. So somebody saying great story and good result, and everybody's been saying thank you for sharing. What a great story, Marion. But it says only someone as resolute and articulate as yourself gets the result. Sadly, not all carers are as resolute or articulate. So I suppose the other message is we need to have a system where you don't have to fight for this, where it is
absolutely
standard.
I would hate it, and sometimes I don't like telling the story because it sounds so positive and that's okay for you, and it wasn't okay. It was hard, but I think that advocate worker was the one that gave me the strength, because just having somebody else there asking on your behalf. And definitely I've been through this, but I don't think anyone else should ever have to go through this to get what I've got. This should make sense to the government. This should make sense to, if we have a national care service, it should make sense to them that you just go for the focus. Nobody should have to go through what I've gone through, because you're right, I don't know where I got the strength from, but I must have got it from somewhere, and not everybody. And I remember the time when I could never go to meetings or anything like that. I just was too tired or too depressed or didn't have the time or anything. I absolutely get that, and I don't know where I get the strength from now. But I did, thank goodness, and it's worked out.
Thank you so much, Marion. That's been really inspiring, and I hope it gives some hope that we can improve things. We can have a good social care system if we build on what we know works and we trust people.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be up to carers to do that. It shouldn't be up to carers. We have enough to be doing. Carers have enough to be doing. That's what our government's to do, to make it easier for us. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
So many fantastic comments in the chat box, Claire, for Marion and Laura. So we'll share those, Marion, after today if you're not able to. Well, there's too many probably for you to read through just now. And one point, building on what you were saying, Claire. So Marion's been illustrating and bringing to life the principles that you mentioned earlier, Claire. And one of the comments in the chat box was rights, not fights. Summing it all up nicely.
I'm gonna name our submission that. That's great.
I don't know if that's copyrighted, Caroline, but we're having it. So Claire, am I okay to come in now at this point?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Graham.
So thank you everybody for your comments there, and keep that feedback coming for Marion. Thank you so much, Marion and Laura, for sharing your story today. We now have a bit of time. We've been talking about short breaks. We will have a short break in 20 minutes time. But in the meantime, so Claire's outlined the principles that the coalition wants to make as part of their submission in response to the Feely Review consultation. As she mentioned at the start of her input, she's looking for those to be approved and signed off today so that they can make the submission. So I'm going to reshare the slides that Claire was sharing and then open it up for discussion, and then we can poll to formally approve or otherwise the submission that Claire would like to put in. So first of all, let's just open it up just in case there are questions or responses to what we've heard from Claire or Marion first of all. But there are 4 specific points to go through with you, and I can open those up when we're ready. And there's almost 50 people in the room, so if you could help us out just by either coming in the chat box, or if you see down at the bottom of the screen, we've got the reactions button and you can raise your hand there. We'll look out for those and bring you into the conversation. So first of all, just any thoughts, questions or reflections from what we've heard so far from our 2 speakers. And if there's not, then we'll move on to our specific questions for you. Hi, Jim, you've raised your hand. Would you like to come in? If you just unmute yourself and come into the chat.
One thing I think that we need to address is this timescale, right? This keeps occurring with carer after carer after, you know what I mean, whereby they ask for things to be done, which is their right, right, you know, to have, right? And councils seem to just sort of, you know, if we keep putting it off long enough, they'll go away, right? You know, something needs to be done. There needs to be timescales set whereby people, you know, could look at knowing that, you know, the service will be delivered or not delivered, right, within a certain timescale. This is something that we need. Right? We have this problem as it stands with carer support plans, you know, where it takes months and months and months to get carers to get a support plan. And that's not just for themselves, that's something for the care for person as well. Right? And this is an issue that needs to be looked at.
Thank you, Jim. So I know Claire mentioned simple, fair and transparent, and we'll show that slide again shortly. But yeah, speedy as well, timely. One of the comments in the chat box was hassle-free, which I think just summed that all up nicely. That's super, thank you, Jim. Let's head to Ivan, who's also raised his hand there. Hi, Ivan, just unmute yourself and come on in.
I was just wrestling with the technology there, so I'm back in. Yeah, it's a point that picked up in Marion's presentation, really, about this right, not fight. And we are talking about quite a significant culture change within social work. A lot of because the accountability for the money eventually ends up with the social worker, they're very, very conservative in the way that they make decisions. And I think if we're going to be equal partners, we need to break those barriers down. I mean, my experience with SDS is much the same as Marion's. I was fortunate because I had a good background before I left the council, so I knew what I was up to. Not everybody has that information, so it's about providing people with information so they can challenge the culture. The comments that were made to Feely about, you know, well, family members should do it for nothing, you know, they're family members and you can't employ family members. There's a massive resource issue around actually delivering a national care service. I mean, I've had trouble recruiting appropriate carers to look after my wife. Everybody's different, so we've got to raise the profile of caring. It's got to be an honourable profession where people. It's not something that people do because no one else will do it. It's got to be something that we aspire to, and so there's a whole range of culture changes that we have to address in order to make this work. That the whole national care service is so aspirational. We're not going to get there in a week, basically, and we've got to work a strategy that moves us from where we are now to where we want to be, and what are the significant gains over that period. I thought it was a lovely presentation by Marion. It mirrored my journey with my wife, but I think we do have to look. One of the first things we have to do is to start to break down some of the cultural values within the social work system, because Their training, their background, their experience leads them to believe that they have to be conservative. They live in a blame culture. I can understand why they do it. I've looked on both sides of the fence. If anything goes wrong with an SDS package, it's not invariably, it's not the individual package holder, it's the social worker who authorized it, that is up, whose job is on the line occasionally. So those are things we have to change.
Thank you, Ivan. That's really interesting. So I said there's 4 specific questions and polls that we've got for you. The first one and the fourth one relate to the system, which can sound a bit abstract, but you've made that real, Ivan, for exactly what we're talking about. So we've got 2 more questions queued up. Let's see if it's possible to hear from both of the Annes, Anne Pike first of all, before then we'll move on to our poll. So let's hear from Anne Pike and then Anne McDougall and then see how we're doing. Hi, Anne.
Thanks, Graham. It's just in relation to 2 points that were made, one by Ivan and one by Marion, and it's around the whole cost. I think there's always dialogue around how much all of this costs, but as Marion says, there's never a lot of chat about how much getting it right actually saves in the bigger picture. And that is so important, because if we always talk about cost and not about what some of getting it right actually overall saves, then people are frightened to put the right things in place.
Thank you.
And just a sort of secondary point around culture, I've been currently working with a group of African women around getting help and getting, you know, some form of financial help, and culturally that's just not acceptable to them. So I think there's nuances within all this where we really are strong about getting the right level of payments for doing this valuable work, but some people that's not an acceptable position, and it's how do you work around that?
Right. Thank you, and those additional considerations. I know that Claire's presentation made some reference to that, but the specifics are really helpful. Thank you, Anne. Let's bring in Anne McDougall. Peter, we'll get to you if there's time. So thanks for your patience, everyone. Hi, Anne McDougall, do you want to come in? Oh, just mind and unmute yourself.
Mute. There we go.
There we go.
One of the points, when I was listening to the presentation, when Claire was talking about the key principles and the key messages, one of the things that struck me was that people are not assessed properly at the beginning. And I think what we need to be looking at when we're putting in recommendations is looking for skilled assessors who can assess people properly and not go into a house for 10 minutes or 20 minutes and that's all they do, and they make a judgment in that, because that quite often happens.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anne. Brilliant. Nice and clear. I won't attempt to summarise that. It's nice and clear. Thank you. Peter, let's. What I'm aiming to do is, if we can move into the polls by 11 o'clock to make sure we're into a break by 10 past. So, Peter, I think we should have time to bring you in briefly. Thank you, Anne.
Yeah, it's just an additional comment on the cost versus benefit, if you like. Some years ago, I did an exercise. I took the number of carers and the type of carers, the hours they worked in Angus from the census, the 2011 census, and I calculated if we paid them at the SDS rate, instead of providing all the free care that they do provide, by not paying them, Angus, as an IJB, was saving 128 million pounds a year. And that was 125% of their total budget for social care and for the NHS. So I was quite disappointed that we didn't have a census this year, but it's an exercise you might want to carry on next year. The spreadsheets are all there. It shows you the number of hours they worked. I just took all the midpoints of the ranges, calculated at the current SGS rate in Angus, and lo and behold, that's the number. And that's a number which you can flag at anybody and everybody every time you meet them.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a bit like we heard from Marian's presentation. It's making it easy to say yes to the request, isn't it? Making it harder to say no. Thank you. Thank you everyone for those contributions. Feel free to keep them coming in the chat box, and Claire will keep an eye on that, because what I'm about to do means that I won't be able to monitor those as they come in. But hopefully the technology lets me do this. You should now hopefully be seeing the same slides that Claire shared, but I've just done some highlighting to help focus on hopefully the key points, because there's a lot on the screen. And what we're going to do is to go through each of these 4 principles that the Coalition would like to be recommending back to Scottish Government in the consultation, and to be seeking your approval for those messages after the year-long consultation or so that the Coalition have been doing. So this is now really finalising the submission that will be made. So the first one relates to the purpose and value of social care. The principles are on the screen, and I'll open the poll now. You should see the button pop up on your screen that lets you submit your response. And you'll see that it's basically asking, do you agree with the principles that are on your screen? And you can agree with all of them. You can agree with some of them, and feel free in the chat box to tell us which, or any that you disagree with. And if there's anything missing, you can choose to agree with the principles, but add others. So for instance, I'm not sure, Claire, that we mentioned timeliness like Jim suggested. I think the other points we heard are probably reflected in here, but I'll let you all be the judge of that. You also have the option, obviously, to disagree with what's there. And again, comments in the chat box would be helpful. But this is grand. So far, we've heard from 20 people in the poll so far, but we've many more to hear from. So please give us your responses if you can. I'll leave that running for a little while longer. And what Claire and Shabana at the Coalition are looking for is basically approval of these messages, or Anne used that word nuance, maybe some of that nuance for the messages. So the chat box will be super helpful for that. So Claire, I think everybody's busy working out the polling. We're not seeing anything in the chat box yet, but do just let me know if you're seeing anything there. Okay, we've heard from almost everybody. I'll just, I feel like maybe I should be an auctioneer with my gavel. Going once, going twice. We'll just allow another few seconds there for the last few votes to come in. That's brilliant.
So far in the chat, Graham, just people saying they agree with adding in timeframes.
Bill. That's helpful, thank you. So there's our results. So we have agreement, Claire, with I think 2 or 3 comments just about nuance in there. So if that's all okay, everybody, then I will move on to the second. So that was about the system, and that's maybe slightly more abstract, but I imagine this one there will be lots of comments on the principles relating to carers. Now I've highlighted again what stood out as possibly some of the key points just to make it easy to read on the screen, but take your time reading through those. Do you approve these principles? And all of the same 4 questions that we're looking at now have got exactly the same answer format, so exactly the same options as you've just had. And again, I've opened that poll now. Principles relating to carers, do you agree with those? And exactly the same 4 options we've just seen. You can agree with some, let us know which ones you would like to add. If there's others to add, let us know that. And if there's anything you disagree with. Thank you everybody for your responses. They're coming in nice and quickly. This is really helpful. Claire, I can see a couple of comments appearing in chat. Is there anything that we need to summarize, or is it just notes for you to make for the submission?
Yeah, so it's just talking about the human rights-based approach should include accountability and transparency of process. There's always a gap between theory and reality. So that's from Hannah at the Alliance, and I know she's coming on later probably to talk a bit more about that. So
yes, that's going to be great.
I think it's a universal thing, isn't it? We agreed having a human rights approach, but not everybody, or not, well, very few people know exactly what that means in practice. And
I think it might have been Martin, forgive me if I've not got that right, but somebody had to say in the chat a few minutes ago that rights are pointless unless they're enforceable. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And I've realised as well, I'm not reading through what's on the screen, but do give me a shout, anybody, if it would help me to read through the principles that are outlined on the screen, but hopefully you're seeing those nice and clearly. And again, actually, Claire, less equivocally than in the first question, we've got clear approval for that one. So if we keep moving at this pace, hopefully that's comfortable for people. We may have time for 1 or 2 more comments before we break, or be able to break early and have a bit more time to hear from other speakers later on. Hannah's queued up for us. So the third of the 4 principles that Claire outlined is regarding all social care recipients. And same as before, I will just if I can get my technology working, look for your approval of these principles that are on the screen. There we go. Same options as before. Agree, disagree, agree with comments in the chat box, or anything else that's missing. So this is the principles for all social care recipients, not just carers. This is where, Anne, you'd mentioned specific challenges and barriers there might be to accepting support or accessing breaks. That's broadly referenced here, but do feel free to add more comment in there. We've heard from most people. Typically, Claire, we're hearing from about 40 people in the votes, so I'm usually just waiting until we've heard from 41 this time. That's fab. 42. I feel like the odd one out. I'm not getting to cast a vote, but it's not about me. I think, Claire, we're probably sitting out, so in which case we've heard from actually everybody on this one. So let's share those results for you. Again, a little bit of nuance. Please let us have that in the chat box. If there's others that you would like to add, 2 people, Claire, wanted to add things to this. We are okay for time. So if you were one of those 2 people who'd said you would like to add to them, do you want to come in on the mic and tell us? Because I'm not sure those are appearing, Claire, in the chat box. Perhaps
no, we just had one comment from Ivan, just with rights come responsibilities and accountability.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Very true.
Thank you.
And Christine has said we also need to take into account working carers.
Ah, interesting. Thank you.
Which is absolutely true.
I can see that Joan has unmuted. Joan, were you one of the ones who wanted to come in with an additional one?
I think, picking up on the rural and island communities, that has got to be given, a lot of consideration, because they are very isolated. And for Oban area, we don't have a nursing home. So, if there's respite and the cared for person's got to go in, then, they have to go down to Dunoon or Helensburgh. So definitely a lot of issues around for rural and island communities.
So that one you agree should stay in there. That's helpful. Thank you, Joan. Thanks for coming in. Was there anyone else who had things to add, things that are missed here?
Anne has just commented, I like to think of hard to reach communities more are easy to ignore communities.
Yes, absolutely.
I think it's a good point, Anne.
Thank you. I clicked too many buttons there when I was bringing Joan in. Claire, am I sharing the poll results already for social care recipients?
Yes, you're sharing. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. That's great. Okay, thank you. So if that's all okay, again, we have approval there for you, Claire. And the final one then, again, this is relating back to the system, some of the things that Ivan was mentioning, and the social care system overall. Again, final poll for you this morning. Thank you, everybody, for all of your contributions so far. And can I get my poll working system overall? And once we've heard your feedback from this one, we'll take a break. Same 4 answer responses as you've had already. We'll do these polls later on as well. So after the break, we'll be hearing, first of all, from the Coalition of Care Providers in Scotland, Chris Cregan, and then we'll move on to Hannah Tweed from the Health and Social Care Alliance. And for each of those, there'll be the opportunity for feedback on what they're proposing as well. And we'll conclude later on with a final poll or 2 to get feedback on the session today. Give you a few more minutes. I think people are thinking, Claire, a bit more about this one, taking slightly longer for the responses to come in, but that's okay. We'll give people a bit of time. That's great. That's them coming in now. System overall. Claire, it looks like the chat box might be just about as busy as the poll actually on this one.
Yep. So Martin's just come in and said carers more than one should be at the top table to shape the National Care Service direction. Absolutely. There are carers on the current Social Covenant oversight group. Marion, who you heard from today, and Shabana, who many will know, who is our Partnership Development Officer. And it is in the consultation that carers will be on the board when it's set up. So we need to make sure that happens. But I think Martin makes a good point that it should be more than one. It's very hard for one carer to represent all of carers. So there needs to be more carers with a voice. And Kimberly says, and paid to take part, which is something we've been consulting on as well. Scott says, oh, I was going so fast, I'll have to go back up again. There must be more detail and less generality in the statements. Thanks, Scott. We will be adding detail to them. So, with each statement, I will go back and provide comments from carers and also provide a bit of detail on how we think it should work. Kirstine says we need a shift in culture. And again, people saying voting rights for carers should be at the heart of decision making. So carers as equal partners is really important for people.
Thank you. Great summary, Claire. That's not easy doing that. Thank you. And for what it's worth, although we'd already done the poll by that point, when you mentioned those 2 points from Martin, there was lots of nods around the room. So that carers should be at the table and there should be more than one. Fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone, for your contributions so far. Thank you again to Marion and Laura for sharing their story today. Like I say, once we come back from the break, we'll hear 2 more inputs. We'll be getting more feedback from you as we go. But we're now at the stage to be able to move into the break. Claire, if that's okay, a couple of minutes early. We will reconvene at 20 past when we will hear from Chris Cregan from the Coalition of Care Providers in Scotland, and then we'll hear from Hannah from the Health and Social Care Alliance. Hope you're having a good session so far, everybody. Give us your comments in the chat box as we go, and we will see you back here in 10 minutes time. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Graham. Is Chris here? Do you know? Shall I check?
Not yet. Not yet. He'll be arriving shortly.
We may need to just swap if he's not here.
Yes, that's true. Hannah's been here. That's grand.
I'm going to get a cup of tea. You don't need me for anything just now, do you?
No, I will remove your spotlight and I'll...
Behind the scenes to collate all those comments, but please keep discussing in the chat if there's anything else you want us to discuss or pick up. We're going to move on again, and we're going to have 2 speakers, and there will also be time after the 2 speakers to have a discussion and to ask questions and some more polls. But firstly, I'm glad to introduce Chris from the Coalition of Care Providers in Scotland. And Chris is going to share their key messages in relation to commissioning of services and supporting the workforce. Thanks, Chris.
Morning, everybody. Hi, I'm Chris Cregan. I'm an Associate Director with CCPS, the Coalition of Care and Support Providers in Scotland, working with CCPS particularly on issues around adult social care reform and on the proposed creation of a national care service. I think I know 1 or 2 of you from various other bits of my working life. I was previously Chief Exec of the Scottish Commission for Learning Disability, and I chair the board of SAMH, the Scottish Association for Mental Health. So what I want to do this morning, and thank you for the invitation, is just give you a kind of headline view of the emerging response to the Scottish Government's proposals on the creation of a national care service from CCPS. And I'm actually just hot foot out of a CCPS board meeting where I was just taking CCPS's board through the emerging shape and tone and content of our response, which is based on consultation with member organisations and with a whole series of conversations that we've had, not just since the proposals were published, but over a number of years actually around adult social care reform. It is a work in progress that I'm involved in. The response to the Scottish Government's proposals is, as you will know, is due in a couple of weeks, and so I have the task at CCPS of pulling together a whole load of work which is being done by colleagues in the team and by various subcommittees, and reflects, as I say, discussions with boards, CCPS member boards and individuals. I guess one of the things to say in terms of just the shape of our response, it's obviously a huge consultation to grapple with. It's a very important one, and we'll be both responding to the detail of the questions in the government's proposals, although not all of them, because many of our member organisations will be focusing on some of the issues of detail that we don't have a CCPS view on. But we'll also be providing a sort of parallel parallel narrative response to the proposals, because we want to respond to them in the most coherent way possible. I'll talk briefly about just give you a kind of sense of what some of our top line messages are in terms of an overview of the proposals. And then I know there are a couple of key areas that that Claire asked me to focus on in terms of some of the detail of how we will respond. Just in terms of the overview, CCPS has been very, very positive about the Feely review, the independent social care review, and welcomed its findings early this year. And one of the things that I think we are concerned about across the CCPS membership is that the Scottish Government's proposals, for whatever reason, and there may be explanations for that, for whatever reason, don't match the kind of ambition that we saw reflected in the review's findings. And in particular, it feels as though there is a kind of a lack of a coherent change model for social care reform, which will be really important if we're to achieve the kind of change that we want to see on the ground. There is a lot of emphasis in the proposals from the Scottish Government on structures and practices, and some of those things can be important, but there's a lot of emphasis on structures and practices at the expense, it seems to us, of a clear and coherent focus on culture change, on behaviours. And so we will be welcoming the kind of increased focus on social care that is kind of inherent in the Scottish Government's proposals for the creation of a national care service. But we will be offering a kind of a critique, if you like, of our concerns in that respect. And I think there's an emerging sense, as I'm talking to CCPS member organisations, that not only do these proposals, as they stand at the moment from the Scottish Government, not match the kind of ambition that we welcomed so much with Derek Feely and his team's review earlier this year, but there is a risk that that in the proposals to create a national care service, that social care becomes subsumed into a kind of health delivery model in a way that is potentially extremely risky. We've also been very strong in some of our narrative at CCPS on the need for a really clear focus on co-production in the design and delivery of a national care service with those supported and supporting social care. That was really strongly underlined by the review, and we're not seeing it so far, despite, for example, the establishment of the Social Covenant Group. We're not really seeing it in the work that the Scottish Government is doing around these proposals so far, nor in the proposals themselves. I'll say a little bit about CCPS's kind of emerging thinking on the structure and scope of the National Care Service as proposed by the Scottish Government in its proposals. And I think one of the concerns that's emerging from our conversations, and it's just been echoed in the conversation I had with board members this morning, is that welcome though the focus on social care is, there is the potential for a system to be created here that is over-centralised and yet disjointed and fragmented. And there's kind of quite a strong emphasis on a kind of a command and control approach to change and to the delivery of social care, and insufficient focus in these proposals as they stand. And obviously we're early on in the process, but insufficient focus on really enabling the kind of local flexibility and accountability which will be important to transformational change in social care. There's a real mix of views amongst the CCPS membership about the merits of extending the scope of a national care service beyond adult social care, which was really the focus of the early review. And I think some of that's based on the fact that however logical it may be to extend the scope of a national care service, there wasn't really a kind of detailed prior consultation about the extension of scope that we see in the current proposals. And there's a kind of a lack of detailed thinking about the rationale for extending the scope as fulsomely as is proposed, and a concern about where these proposals around a national care service align with strategy and policy and delivery in relation to a whole host of other policy areas, for example, the promise in relation to children and young people services. On commissioning and procurement, CCPS is, of course, as a providers organisation, been working on this over a number of years, and last year we published our big ideas document on options for changes to the system of commissioning and procurement. And I think again, and obviously we will be trying hard to be constructive as we can in our response to these proposals, but there is again a concern that the proposals in the Scottish Government's current consultation are kind of quite underwhelming in terms of commissioning and procurement, and really insufficiently radical to bring about the kind of transformational change that we would want to see. Of course, there's a focus there on ethical commissioning, and in a sense, who could disagree with the principle of ethical commissioning? But I think our view, and the strong view of CCPS members that's emerging, is that in the absence of changes to procurement policy and practice, and if there is a continued focus on price-based competition and on competitive tendering, then we will not see the kind of change to commissioning and procurement which will bring about real change for those who are in receipt of and supported by social care.
3 or 4 minutes, Chris.
And then on workforce, which is the other area Claire asked me to just focus on, there is a whole parallel stream of work that we're involved in at CCPS on fair work, and I think kind of core messages in the CCPS response here are likely to be around the need, of course, for improved pay, for improved terms and conditions, for better access to training and development, and a concern that deeds need to follow words, that doing needs to follow thinking. So there is a lot of warm words in recent times about the value social care workers add to society, about the importance of workforce representation and so on. But what we need to see here is action. What we need to see here is a coherent pay policy for all workers in social care. That's workers in the third sector as well as in the statutory sector, and across all disciplines in the third sector. So there'll be a strong focus in the CCPS response on some of these issues. And I think there, along with commissioning and procurement, one of the things that we'll be wanting to say in our response is that, again, whilst the proposals on the National Care Service are welcome, of course, this is going to take quite a number of years to achieve. We're looking at a programme of legislation and implementation over the lifetime of the Parliament, of this Parliament and beyond, and there's an urgent need for change and for improvement and for investment and for action now in terms of both commissioning and in terms of fair work. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Kimberly, back to you.
Thanks very much, Chris. Thank you very much. I think we're hoping to hear from another speaker and then open up to some questions, if that's okay. But there's been lots of comments in the chat box, so we'll hopefully get round to answering some of them, Chris, if that's okay. And just if there isn't anything we get answered today, we'll hopefully, I'm just looking at Graham and Claire, that we'll hopefully get answers if people have got anything that we've not managed to cover today. I'd just like to introduce next Hannah Tweed from the Health and Social Care Alliance. So thanks for joining us, Hannah, and over to you.
So just while Hannah's getting queued up, so we only had comments for Chris rather than questions, Kimberly, so nothing to worry about there, but certainly we can collate those for people if it's helpful. Apologies, Hannah, back to you.
No, that was entirely my failing at going, I've gone full screen without unmuting myself. You know, we're only 18 months into this digital literacy thing. Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation to speak today and for the material people have been sharing earlier in the session. It's been really useful insight to me, and somewhat reassuringly, there's a great deal of overlap, which is always a good sign. And I fully intend to say what Chris said, with a great deal of the overlap for our work on commissioning procurement in response to the consultation. So one of the things that I wanted to kick off with is saying that as part of putting together the Alliance's response to the National Care Service consultation, beast that it is, we've been drawing very heavily on the My Sport, My Choice People's Experiences of Self-Directed Support project that I was involved in with a range of people from across Scotland, as well as the engagement events we did to inform the Feely Review and specific events for the National Care Service itself. And the idea behind drawing on all of that is so that we've got a really good snapshot of people's experiences during the pandemic, people's experiences immediately pre-pandemic, and all of that sort of mixed bag of what's working, what's not working, and how should this then inform these fairly wide-ranging, I think is one of the terms people using, proposals. Including what we think hasn't been asked and should be asked and therefore answered. So quite a few of these questions, as I suspect a number of other colleagues across the third sector are doing, we're answering the question, we're also answering the question that we think should have been asked and wasn't. Because as is covered in the chat today in great detail, there's a lot of stuff that people need to hear. And it's not being really given space for in a lot of this current layout. So we're trying to sort of balance those approaches. Three of the areas that I'm going to talk about specifically here, rather than trying to cover all 126 odd pages of the current draft, it's at least, I'm sorry, are the significance of human rights-based approaches and some of the practicalities therein, the role of the third sector within the consultation, but also specifically within design, implementation and follow through within the National Care Service. And you're going to get a bit of my pet rant on data collection and the importance of appropriate data collection on social care in order to actually follow through on the promises and potential in some of these proposals and to counter some of those risk factors that are being highlighted. There's a lot of if statements in that, which again echoes Claire's earlier summary. So one of the things that we're threading throughout a huge range of our responses to these questions is the need for human rights-based approaches to be really thoroughly embedded. And that means not just putting them sort of in the rhetoric of the opening framing, which is very welcome, and we're pleased to see so much acknowledgement of the importance of human rights, but it needs to be really consciously and in detail threaded through. So we get very specific about the need to explicitly integrate equalities and human rights into all parts of this proposed system. So the legislation, the fiscal frameworks, the inspection setups, material around regulation, commissioning. When it comes to some of this very fine detail of those questions, saying this needs to be really, really thought through, and people need to have appropriate training in knowing what those rights mean, both in terms of people accessing services, right, not fight, as mentioned earlier, but also the people delivering them. I don't want to end up with a situation where all you get is social workers on the front line with huge caseloads, also being expected to do more data collection without more time to do so, and also being expected to implement human rights-based approaches without appropriate training in what that really means. You're not going to get the societal culture shift that we've been talking about earlier, unless you really thread that through. So some of the things that we're embedding as part, we're proposing as part of that is including panel principles. So that's participation, accountability, non-discrimination, equality, empowerment, and legality. So lots of overlap with the sort of conversations around partnership and sort of meaningful engagement with folk that's been talked about earlier. And that really needs to not be tokenistic. It can't just be a one-off, it can't be this consultation. It needs to be design, implementation, follow through improvement processes. And that involvement of unpaid carers, disabled people, people living with long conditions needs to be at every stage of that process. And people need to have voting rights and they need to be properly remunerated. But that's a separate section I haven't been asked to talk about. There's also a real question here around the accessibility. I've had a lot of conversations with colleagues and friends across the NCS work about how not accessible some sections of this are. And that really needs to be taken on board and learnt from as these are being, as actions are being taken forward. Because if it's not accessible, you're going to be leaving out huge sections of the population who have insight that is valuable and needed. And all of this boils down to, at the end of the day, the human right to equal access to social care, that people should have the right to community engagement, the right to live independently, to have family life, all of these things that are possible when SDS is done right and when social care is done right, but that aren't the norm, that isn't the default across an equal system across 32 local authorities. Another thing that we think is a key part of that and that we're threading throughout our response is the role of the third sector. So there needs to be a real consistent effort to support and work directly with and acknowledge the expertise of third and independent health and social care organisations as equal and valued partnerships. And as part of that means sustainable, ongoing and secure funding. Because at the moment, there's a real system where you have year-on-year, 12-month contracts. It means people can't have consistency, you can't build on existing learning, you can't develop as much easily as you could and effectively as you could with a more sustainable system in place. My bullet point on reforming the commissioning and procurement processes, I think has been covered in part, so I'm going to skip that one. And that really links into valuing as well the role of independent advocacy and independent support and advice organisations that could provide that sort of separate but supportive role. That was something that came out very clearly in my Sport My Choice, that people valued from and benefited from it. And it's something that we think needs to be preserved and highlighted more throughout the planning for the NCS. Because what we have in potential here is also something that doesn't need to replicate some of the known problems in the NHS, excellent as it is in a whole bunch of ways, that this is an opportunity to try on different approaches and to make sure those systems are embedded early.
And apologies, it's taken me far too late to realise that we're not seeing the slides progress. I think you're currently on your slide 5, but we're still on your slide 1. Apologies, I'd spotted far too late.
That is bizarre.
We did get, there was a message earlier, no, don't worry, there was a message earlier saying that you were experiencing low bandwidth. What I'll do is, we can do it the Downing Street way if we need to. I can try sharing my screen and you can be my remote control moving me on. So, to be
honest, I don't think I've said anything that isn't on the screen, so I'm just going to restart the share. I do apologise. I do normally try and
see how that goes.
Let's see if this works.
Thank you, Anne, for asking. There we go.
Yeah, I've lost the option to. Where's my taskbar gone? I think that you're now going to get the joys of my note slides, which is not ideal. Anyway, you can. Is that showing up for folk with the data gathering analysis?
That is showing, and I think if you see the display settings in the middle top of your screen there, I think you can choose not to show your notes up there.
Yeah, I normally have that available and it's disappeared. So we're just going to run with it.
Okay,
so
thank you.
We've got a few minutes left,
thank you.
If that's okay with people. You can put up with my slightly longer written version. One of the things that I think is really linked to this and we're threading throughout our response is the need to improve social care data collection in Scotland. At the moment, it's really patchy, and I'm not saying that to critique Public Health Scotland or the individuals appropriate for responsible for analysis. It's a really mishmash system that people are working with. But if we don't have disaggregated data gathering and intersectional analysis, we can't effectively target or the areas where material isn't working. So there's a real need throughout this to properly embed protected characteristic analysis, cross-intersectional material, in order to have the data to inform those decisions around policy making and priority of funding, because that is going to be part of what's happening in the next 5 years. And I feel very passionately that without good data, you can't effectively follow human rights principles of equality, non-discrimination, participation and inclusion. So it really needs to be embedded early. Sorry if I slightly lost the thread there with the lack of PowerPoint. I did intend to have a thank you slide with my contact details and saying that we would really welcome anyone's input on this if they wish. And I'm happy to talk more about any of the details there if I didn't cover things sufficiently. So yes, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Hannah, and apologies for interrupting it. It was far too late for me to spot and spotted around about the same time, but thank you so much. We are actually fine for time, so we'll if people have comments or questions. The only one so far, Hannah, was just if you would be okay if we shared the slides with people maybe as a PDF afterwards. Cool, thank you, Hannah. Okay, so as with the CCPS presentation, it looks like mostly comments coming in, Hannah, rather than the questions. If you're able to stick around for a little while longer, I'll hand back to Kimberly, and then we'll move into just getting some feedback on the principles that you and Chris have been sharing. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks to Hannah and Chris. I wanted to thank them from the coalition. And we're just going to move in now to some open discussion and to some polls. So hopefully some of these comments will turn into questions. So I'm going to pass back to Graham and Claire, and we're going to do that now.
Okay, thank you, Kimberly. And if you keep an eye on the chat box as well, in case there's anything coming in there. Claire, I'll just bring you in as well. So thank you to both of our speakers then. So we've heard about commissioning from Chris, and we've heard about workforce and more from Hannah. Same as we did before we took the morning break, an opportunity to see if you have any thoughts or reflections generally before we then again seek approval of further messages for the review. So just an open question first of all. So same as before, if you use the reactions button down the bottom of the screen to raise your hand, which Anne has done. Hi Anne, if you want to come on in.
Hi Graham, thanks. It was just picking up on a point by Hannah, and it's just a bigger general concern that I have around the third sector, because when you look at the extension of what we're being consulted on now and what's going to happen possibly with IJBs and the link to local authorities, there is a fear for me that the third sector in commissioning arenas could be squeezed out. And I think that is a big impact that we potentially have with these latest proposals. So I've fed that back through the IJB feedback, because although in an IJB setting it's not particularly their responsibility in terms of the response, but the actual overall knock-on effect, both of the third sector organisations, their knowledge, but also the volunteering capacity within the third sector, if that gets affected, that has really serious implications on cost, etc. around this. That's just my personal fear.
Thank you, Anne. With it being a third sector issue, I imagine it's one Chris would want to come to, but Hannah, you were noticeably nodding away there during Anne's question. So let's come to you first, Hannah.
Yeah, sorry, I do a lot of sort of Churchill dog nodding. Please excuse me. Yeah, no, I absolutely recognise that, and I think that I completely agree that it's a real and valid risk, particularly given that we know the proportion of third sector, particularly small organisations during the pandemic, have had massive crunches to their funding. So to quote somebody who attended one of the Alliance events on the consultation, we won't know what we've lost until we've lost it. with the third sector, with smaller organisations that just, once they're gone, and then you lose that expertise, you lose that community engagement. We're talking earlier about that balance between centrality and community, and I think local third sector community-based organisations and volunteering organisations are a really key part of that, and it's a really key part in as well, overlapping with earlier comments from Claire about when you have conversations about who is best to deliver services or conversations around social care arrangements, etc. Volunteer services are listed in this consultation, but without that commitment to funding. And you can have it both ways. There's got to be a detailed plan to engage with that and engage with sustainability, particularly when you consider that we know from My Support, My Choice and from other research done within the sector that some people have greater trust for community-based organisations than they perhaps do for local authorities or larger organisations. And I'm not wading into the whys and wherefores, but it is a known, it exists. So that needs to be acknowledged and considered within this wider planning if you are to get that balance between centralism and localism correct. Endran.
Thank you, Hannah. Just to do some signposting, Chris, we'll come to you for an opportunity to contribute if you would like. To do some signposting, we can allow the conversation to flow for another 10 minutes or so, and we'll then wrap up with a quick poll on the messaging we've had from Hannah and Chris before we move into the formal business of the day, the AGM. So Chris, we had the comment about third sector possibly getting squeezed out. We've talked also about costing and funding.
Yes, thanks. And I've been following the comments in the chat. It's really helpful to see. If you're able to, I have been following it, but if you're able to provide me with a kind of a summary of that as well, Claire, afterwards, that would be great. Because I think we're just keen at CCPS to build all the feedback and thinking we possibly can into the narrative of how we respond to this. Just on the point about third sector, yes, of course, I completely understand the concern that's been expressed. Of course, ironically, the big kind of polarized discussion that's going on out there between arguably Scottish Government and COSLA is around local authorities feeling that their role in relation to the provision of services being squeezed out, relegated. They become potentially, in terms of these proposals, providers alongside third sector providers because of the redirection of roles and responsibilities and resources to IJBs. So there's a kind of an irony there, but I completely take the point. And I think one of the key points for us here is that whilst in one sense the proposals around the composition, the reframed composition of local health, social care community boards is welcome. Actually, if you don't at the same time enable real change to commissioning practice and to the kind of innovative practice which we know is possible, alliancing and so on, much more collaborative models of commissioning. If those local boards are made up of different people, but doing the same thing, then we will not see the kind of change on the ground that we want to see. And also, if the focus is too heavily on national accountability at the expense of local accountability, and the need for local accountability and flexibility, then the third sector organisations that will most likely be the victims, if you like, of that, or to whose detriment it will be smaller, locally based community third sector organisations, because it will be much more difficult for them to flourish in that kind of environment. So completely understand the concerns, and they're well made.
Thank you. So from a nice short input, and we've had some hopefully helpful responses back to your point. Thank you, Chris and Hannah. We're grand for time. There is a question that has appeared in the chat box, which Claire, as a policy bod, might be able to help us with, Chris might be able to, that there's nothing in the consultation about the 1968 Social Work Act, which puts a number of duties on local authorities. Will that continue? I'll give you some time for that one. But Claire, meantime, you've been super patient with your own hand raised. It'd be ironic if we didn't get to hear from you at a coalition event.
I know, I feel a bit cheeky asking a question, but I've actually got a question for Chris, which he touched on. The Feely report, it did mention ethical commissioning, but it more talked about collaborative commissioning, which I'm right in thinking, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, it didn't really feature in the Scottish Government's proposals. So I suppose a technical question, what do you think the difference is? And do you feel collaborative commissioning, that approach would be stronger, particularly in terms of involving local communities in decisions?
Short answer to your question is yes, in the sense that I think collaborative commissioning by its very nature offers more opportunity for sensitivity and flexibility to local need, local demographics, and to the kind of co-production locally that I think we would all want to see become much more commonplace. I think the key issue for us in terms of the difference is that, as I said, we in terms of the big ideas that we published last year, and in terms of our ongoing commentary, we are keen to see an end to the kind of overarching focus on competitive tendering and price-based competition, and different models of collaborative commissioning and alliancing, which mean that commissioning would start from the premise of being values-based as opposed to price-based. Of course, there's a whole conversation to be had around investment and resource, and the scarcity of resource, and the rationing that inevitably comes with that. But I guess we want to see commissioning practice switch, if you like, to the kind of other end of the telescope. The point on the 1968 Social Work Act is not something I'm going to respond to in detail here, but actually it is a point that's come up in conversations with CCPS, so it is something that we'll be responding to in the detail of our response.
Thank you, Chris. And what I'll do, which might help with, I think it was Peter who asked that question, there is a live programme ongoing at the moment exploring collaborative commissioning from CCPS, and I've included a link to the big ideas that you also referenced. Thank you. Claire, hopefully that helps with the question you asked, because that would then allow us to hear from Ivan, and we'll see if we've time to hear from one or two more people before we move into closing up this part of the day. Over to you, Ivan.
Yeah, thank you. I started off feeling quite confident when I came to the meeting about the direction of travel, listening to the risks that seem to be emerging in terms of actually being able to achieve my vision of a national care service, which is a completely inclusive, all singing, all dancing version. I think that this issue about sort of local versus central control, or as you mentioned, Chris, a command control model, which I think the big beasts like the NHS and the councils are very, very expert at manipulating. They like the metrics. They like to better back things up with evidence, and then they'll prove that what they want is right. And we end up in this less collaborative. It's a command control. It's a thing that's very much evidenced in both the NHS and in the councils. And I just wondered how do we take, at the moment, I don't have a clear idea about the direction of travel, where we're going to go, so we can mitigate those strong risks. Because if you look at it, although the value of care has been estimated at millions of pounds, the big beasts have got that in their hands now, and they don't have to do anything to get it again year after year. So how are we going to fix a direction of travel that means that we mitigate against these risks, so we do achieve the sort of vision of a national care service that I think, which was one is collaborative, it's partnership, it's rights based, and looks after the interests of people.
Thank you.
An easy question to answer.
Well, let's see if Chris and Hannah, and possibly also Claire, have ideas about the direction of travel.
A difficult question to answer in a very short space of time, but a point very well made. And I guess, as I've already said, we want to find a way at CCPS of being as constructive as we can in response to these proposals. But I think we are really concerned about the lack of ambition for the kind of transformational change that we want to see and that we saw reflected in the Feely review. And so our kind of overarching comments in response to the consultation will be framed very much in that sense, and the need not to lose the opportunity that's been presented by the independent review. And by the kind of consensus that's emerged on the need for a national care service of some sort, not to lose the opportunity that's been presented. And I think increasingly there's a sense at CCPS that opportunity is in danger of being lost, and that we will have to be messaging strongly around the need for this to get back on track. Because it seems to have kind of lost its way over the course of the last few months, and we're not seeing the kind of ambition reflected in these proposals. I think the other thing to say about that's really important is that this is just one stage in a very long process, this consultation. There will be legislation to follow. There will be secondary instruments to follow that. It is a long process. And at CCPS, our focus at the moment is very much in putting a response into the consultation. But I'm sure in common with the Alliance, with Inclusion Scotland, with SCVO, with others representing the interests of third sector organisations, we will be seeking to continue to influence thinking around a whole raft of issues. Commissioning is obviously one of them in terms of the programme of work that Graham and others have referred to, the investment case, and so on. So we have already commissioned thinking on this. We'll be commissioning more thinking on this, and we'll get our response in over the course of the next couple of weeks. But we will be continuing the whole programme of work to influence governments and key stakeholders thinking on this over the coming months.
Thank you, Chris. An additional question came in for you while you were speaking, which we'll share after today, and it was okay to, if you're comfortable, to provide a response after today. Or it might just be something for you to consider about subsidiarity, which I don't know what that means, so I will leave that to you. We'll pass that on to you. I think, Chris, last time I heard you speak, you described yourself as a glass half empty optimist, which I think summarises your comments nicely. Let's hear from Hannah and then Claire before we move on.
I like that turn of phrase. Yeah, I think, Ivan, your comments are terrifyingly accurate, if I may put it in that way. I think I find when I'm approaching this that there is so much potential in the aspirations outlined here, even with all the codicils and the sort of if it's done in this way, then that's really exciting, and that we know the current system doesn't work for everybody, and it should. So it's the balance between the fact that as a whole, I don't have a direct answer to your question, but what we're trying to do, like Chris and like CCPS and many other organisations, is approach every element of this very complicated picture and go, in what practical ways can we suggest, propose, constructively critique that co-production can be meaningfully embedded here? How can we stress practical human rights tools, training systems? Because what we have is the beginning of culture change. We've got some leadership buy-in, that is really, that's great. It's seeing that followed through, and seeing that followed through at every level, and what campaign work can be done to see that at the end of the day, people have meaningful access to what they should have, the rights that are at the core of this. And if I can be stereotypical, it gets a bit, you eat an elephant in small chunks, by breaking it up into what is doable by individual people. and your staffing levels. But also I think, and I'll jump back to I think it was Shavana's earlier point in the chat about one of the key ways that is possible is by collaborative working across the sector and drawing on those mutual areas of expertise. So really trying to get those communication paths open for the best possible end product. I mean, I could give really specific examples to consultation response bits, but I don't think that's really the nature of your question. But I think it's trying to bring that level of detail and attention by as many people as possible to see that change carried through.
Okay. Yes, and you mentioned, Hannah, I think that as it sat, your response was 130 pages long, so you've both done extremely well to fit in succinct answers today. Chris, you raised your hand as Hannah was starting to give her response. Claire, if it's okay, just to hear from Chris before we come to you, and then we'll move on to the final business of the day. Did you mean to raise your hand there, Chris?
Yeah, I did. No, it was just to respond on the subsidiarity point. Hi, Seb. Seb and I have known each other for a long time, so it's a good question. I think just to reassure there, you know, as I said, as I think I said in terms of my opening remarks, I think, you know, one of the concerns we have about these proposals is that there is an emphasis on national accountability and insufficient emphasis really on local accountability and local flexibility. And in the kind of polarized discussion that's emerged post-Feely review and during the publication of these proposals between the Scottish Government and COSLA, there's been a tendency to think on the part of local authorities that that actually the principle of subsidiarity will be achieved simply by giving local authorities the investment, the money to which they're owed. And actually, from our point of view, the kind of local accountability we would want to see in the provision of social care goes way beyond you know, local democracy, important though that is. And we have steered clear of getting involved in kind of picking a side in that very polarized conversation, because the principle of subsidiarity means that it really means, as Seb has said, taking decisions as close as possible to the citizens. In this case, those are people who are supported by and supporting social care on the ground, and that's why we will be calling for the kind of emphasis on local accountability and local flexibility in terms of co-production models and commissioning locally that we've been talking about during this conversation.
Thank you. Claire, you've been super patient. Thank you, Chris and Hannah, for responding on the spot to questions there. We will make sure you get copies of the comments and questions you've been receiving. Claire, over to you.
Yeah, I'll be brief. First of all, just to agree with what colleagues have said, but I mean, the bottom line is we are not going to change social care by changing systems and structures. Setting up a national care service isn't going to change what it means to people in their homes, and we always have to go back to that. Did it make a difference to somebody with a disability? Did it make a difference to a carer? Did it make their lives better? Setting up a system isn't going to do that. What we need to do is, firstly, well, we have done, we started the process of listening, which I think is really important, and, you know, we shouldn't underestimate the importance of that. We've all been doing a lot of listening since it was launched in August, and we need to gather those views together, which we've been doing in the coalition. And the reason why, you know, as I said in my presentation this morning, we went back to principles. So we looked at the questions that were being asked, and we will answer them, and we do need detail of how it will work, of course we do. But before we look at those details, those processes, we need to look at the principles. And we've been talking all day about the principles, you know, from Marion talking about centering people. We talked about trusting people to know what it is that works for them. We've talked about listening to people and making sure carers, for example, are in every level and are involved. We talked about localism, making sure that, yes, things are decided as close to people as possible and in their communities. And the third sector has a massive role to play in that. And yes, there is a role for a national body to look at principles and standards and improve things. But that is not the only thing, and it's not even the most important thing. So I think that's the message we need to give, and we need to give it strongly, and we'll be saying it for a long time because, as Chris was saying, this is a long process. It'll be a bill going through Parliament, it'll take a few years, it'll need to be set up, etc. All that is going to need time, and it's going to need money. And the other thing that I would just say is they better not spend all the money just in the National Care Service. They need to spend it on the direct services going into people's homes. So that's really key. Let's not allow that to happen. So we just need to keep that in mind, I think, and keep putting, from our perspective, from the coalition, carers front and centre in all this.
Thank you, Claire. That was a fantastic summary. Thank you so much. I'd originally kept Chris and Hannah visible to everybody, but it was such a helpful summary. I thought just if we close with you and a couple of quick polls. Thanks again to Chris and Hannah for joining us today. We do need to move on by 10 past, so super quick polls. Do we agree with and endorse the key messages that Chris has shared from CCPS on commissioning and supporting the care workforce? So that poll is now up and running for you. Chris will also obviously share results with you. Same as before, if your answer is partly or no, feel free to share comments in the chat box. Like I say, we'll make sure that we get those to our guests today. And I'll let that run for just a little while longer. Looking for super quick responses to these ones before we move on to the AGM. I think last year, Claire, we set the world record for an AGM. We have 20 minutes for it today. We'll see if we can get it done in that time. Yeah, we've heard from I think just about everybody. So we've got lots of support for you there, Chris. And if we run the same poll for Hannah at the Alliance, exactly the same question. Are we in agreement in endorsing the messages we heard from Hannah about the purpose of social care and the human rights approach that she was emphasising and we've heard a lot about today? Thank you. Really quick fingers on the polling button now. That's brilliant. Lots of responses coming in. Thank you for those. Like I say, do add any comments to the chat box, including there's been lots of thanks throughout the day to our speakers, so please keep those coming as well. One last time, thank you again to Hannah and Chris for joining us today. We'll now conclude this part of the session. Like I say, hopefully it's been enjoyable and useful for you. We've had requests to share slides. Hannah's confirmed she's happy to share those, and Claire, I'm sure, will be sharing hers that she kicked off the day with. We'll now move into, I'll hand over to Lucinda Godfrey, the co-convener of the Coalition of Carers, because we're now moving into the AGM for the Coalition. So thank you everyone for your contributions and poll responses so far. And Lucinda, I will bring you in now. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Graham. No pressure at all there, but I will try and bash through the AGM as quickly as possible. But there are a few things you might want to take a wee bit of time over in the next. Have I actually got, how long have we got? 20 minutes. Okay. So first of all, just want to say what a fantastic session this morning. I found it really informative, really helpful. And it's only by having these conversations that we can really start to articulate our own views in relationship to the consultation that's gone on. So thanks to everybody for that. So you will have received the previous minute for the AGM. And if there are no questions on that, we'd be looking for a proposer and a seconder for the minute for last year's annual general meeting. So can I have somebody to propose that, please? Kimberly, thank you. And can we have somebody to second it, please? Anne, is that you seconding that? Yes, Anne McDougall, thank you very much. So we'll move on to the convener's report. So you'll all have received a copy of the annual report, and hopefully you'll have had the opportunity to read the key areas of work and highlights over the year from the coalition. And of course, no surprise, these member meetings continue to be a really important part of that work, and still hugely successful online, I have to say. Without these meetings, the coalition really would be challenged. So the fact that we've been able to get so many people attending online has just been fantastic. The other thing as well about the members' meetings, I think it's important to say that it gives us the opportunity to think about life beyond and out with the pandemic. And I think that's really important for the coalition to keep carers matters moving forward in that direction as well. So thank you all for your participation in that over the year. We do as well continue with our learning exchange groups and the Carers Collaborative. Again, really important opportunities for carers to support each other, but also for us to listen and hear from carers across the country. So have a read of the annual report, and if you've any questions about the work, ask Claire or Shabana rather than me. That would probably be the best thing to do. And just talking about Claire and Shabana, they absolutely continue to amaze me, the two of them. I do not understand for the life of me how they manage to do it, and they also do it very well, which is important. They do it with passion, they're extremely knowledgeable, and a huge skill. So thank you to the both of you for again achieving amazing things this year. We appreciate it and we value it, and we're all looking forward to see what you're going to get up to next over the next year. Of course, I want to thank the exec committee for all their hard work. I know a number of them are on the call today, and it's probably, if you have read the annual report, you know that I will be stepping down myself as the joint convener. So this is my last AGM that I will be chairing. So I better stick within the record for last year. I don't want to go out on a downer, but just to say how much I've enjoyed it, and I've enjoyed undertaking the role and having that time with all of you over the years as well. I will be staying on the committee, the exec committee, so they weren't able to get rid of me that easily. So I'll still be around, and will continue, of course, to listen and hear from you as a member of the exec. There are two other members of the exec that will be stepping down and off the exec, and I want to say a few words about that. Seb Fisher, who I think is on the call as well, and Seb is the chief exec of Vocal Care Centre in Edinburgh, and was a founding member of the coalition, and of course a huge voice in the carers movement. And I believe, Seb, the story goes that the coalition was almost disbanded until you stepped in with, I've been trying to think of the most diplomatic way of describing it, your passion and your absolute persistence meant that it kept going. And considering the role the coalition has had and will continue to have over the years, we're all very grateful that you did that. So that was a really huge, important moment for the coalition. I think as well, Seb has this really unique ability to balance challenge with optimism, and to ask the questions, and quite often the difficult ones that need to be asked. And I think that's been so important for us in the coalition and for the exec committee. So thank you, Seb, for all of your commitment and work. And I know you will still be there in the background supporting us as we go forward. So thank you for that. And the second person who will be stepping down is Catherine Patterson, who's also on the call. Hi, Catherine. And Catherine established the Docus Foundation in Lochgilphead and has done so much for carers locally, and specifically making sure the voices of carers in rural areas continue to be heard. And I think, Catherine, for me, that's what you absolutely have brought to the exec, is to keep bringing us back to that carer's voice. And that has been fundamental for us, and not to get distracted by that. And I really wanted to thank you for that, but also Catherine has a great sense of humour, and people in the exec will know that. And Catherine, you always have a way of making us feel better about things. I don't know, you just have that warmth. So thank you so much for all of your support and commitment to the coalition exec. We've appreciated, and we wish you both all the best, of course, but I'm sure we'll see you as well at some point.
Yeah. Like Seb, I'll be backing you all the way, all the time. I've promised that already to the actual group. But I do also want to continue working as part of the remote and rural working group, because that is my passion, as you say.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you too for your help for that. Okay. Okay.
I also want to pay tribute this afternoon to our colleague and friend Donald MacLeod, who sadly passed away in September. And a lot of you will have met and knew Donald, and of course he was hugely committed to the carers movement and the work of the coalition. When I joined the coalition exec, Donald was the co-convener at the time, and latterly I had the opportunity to serve alongside him as the co-convener. And Donald was just so patient and encouraging to me in that role. You know, it felt like quite a big responsibility for me, and just to have that support and encouragement was fantastic. I remember at one of the coalition development sessions that we had, myself and a colleague were having a conversation, and Donald was there and he recommended a book to us. And then at lunchtime went out and bought us both a copy of that book. And I think for me, that just sums up the kindness and his intent ability to really listen. And I think we talk about listening so much, and you know when somebody's really, really listening, and Donald absolutely did that and made every person feel listened to. And that was a very special quality that Donald had. So, you know, we obviously send all of our condolences to Donald's family and friends, and we're lucky to have had the opportunity to work alongside Donald, and I think we you know, will have benefited and will continue to benefit from his work in championing the rights of carers. So now I'm going to move on to the Treasurer's report, and for lots of good reasons I don't deliver that report myself, so I will hand over to Jeff, who's going to tell us how our finances are shaping up. Jeff.
You could tell from the smile on my face that the finances are in pretty good health. Thank you, Lucinda. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to present the Treasurer's report for financial year 2020 to 2021. The accounts have been examined by John Paul, FCIE, who's found them to be true and accurate. At the beginning of the year, we welcomed 5 new elected members to our Executive Committee, and no one had stood down. Our structure, governance, management and objectives remain the same, and we have successfully transitioned to a mainly online model for meetings and information dissemination. This successful adaptation is reflected in our reduced outgoings. We saw an overall increase of £28,898 for the year, compared with a decrease of £46,049 for the previous financial year. A late grant of £24,102 was received after the previous financial year's end, and this is accrued this financial year. So removing this late payment, we see a net increase of £4,796, which means we're spending well within our means. There were 3 major expenditure items during the year, the main one being staff costs, just over 90,000, print, publication, distribution costs of £11,977, and this was a 32% reduction from the previous financial year. And the final main cost was funding of a new website redesign, which hopefully will be launched after the AGM or soon thereafter. So please check out the website and let us know how you feel about the new design. Hopefully you will like it. We certainly do on the committee. The cost of meetings was significantly reduced this year by 64% to £6,207. This cost reduction comes about from our move to solely online meetings. Our primary source of income still remains with the Scottish Government, and we received a grant of £114,883. Received £4,775 in affiliation fees and donations. Thank you for those fees and donations. That was up from £1,625 the previous year, and that's a significant improvement, which is good. In summary, we have a carryover of unrestricted funds of £65,396, unrestricted, that's earmarked funds of £8,636. I can confirm that we're financially solvent and have sufficient unrestricted funds to recover at least 3 months of running costs, legal and financial liabilities in the case of winding up the charity. I would now like to ask for a proposing secretary to agree the presented accounts.
So we've got Catherine and Jeff there, I think. Peter, Catherine and Peter.
Okay, that's good, thank you. And I would also like to ask for a proposing secretary for remaining with our current auditor, John Paul.
Martin and Jim.
Thank you. That's the end of my report, Lucinda.
Thank you, Jeff. Very full, but also you do it in a way where it actually makes sense to people, which is very important. And thank you, Jeff, for all of your work over the year as well, and making sure that the coalition continues to stay within the financial realms of its capabilities. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we move on to the election of committee members, and there has been a list sent to you in advance. There's no new nominations, and we're going to be asked for them all to be voted in. So I think we're going to do a poll for this, so you can see that on your screen. Hopefully, Graham, this will be straightforward.
Yep, and people were super speedy and full approval.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you very much. And last but not least, if there is any other business that anybody would like to raise. No, great. Graham, I think I did that quicker than 20 minutes.
I think you've smashed your own record.
Oh, who'd have thought it?
And
no pressure for the next person.
That's right. You've passed the baton on with a challenge.
So I've also got the job before we finish up of doing some final comments before you can go off and have your lunch. As I said earlier, I think today has just been a fantastic session and opportunity to have some shared opportunity, a shared experience around this massive consultation, and as people have said already, something that is likely to go on for quite a while. I think the coalition has done a fantastic job in its reach in that submission that Claire will be pulling together in terms of the sessions that were undertaken, the sheer numbers of people who participated in the survey. And Claire, thank you for your presentation today. I thought it was very clear, but also very insightful. So not just, people's thoughts, but what they meant. And I think that was really, really important. The other thing, of course, is to thank our guests who joined us today. And Marion, thank you so much for sharing your story. I think everybody said quite clearly in the chat how much that meant to them. And you told a story of being at an event yourself and how somebody's story had inspired you. And I have no doubt that you have made people feel that way today about your story. So thank you for sharing it and for giving us that inspiration as well. And what you also reminded us to do was to remember how important it is to hear what works, because we need to do more of it. So it is important to hear the stories that work and the positive things that can happen for people. So thank you today for that as well. Thanks to Chris and Hannah. And I think the key things for me that came out of that were around Chris's absolutely right in terms of how this whole process and the outcome of it is co-produced fully. And I think that's something we have to continue to raise and to have a focus on. And as well, in terms of Hannah's input around human rights and equality. So I think both of those inputs and opportunity to hear other organisations' views and responses was really, really important as well. And of course, thank you to you, as always, for coming along, for listening, for sharing your views with us, and for your continued engagement and support over the year, because really, you know, that's why the coalition exists. And if you're here and engaged, we know that we must be doing and getting something right. And we'll continue to do better at that, as we always do. So thank you to everybody. I don't know, Claire, if there's anything you want to add before we finish up.
No, thank you very much, Lucinda. And you'll see that we've just put up a poll for feedback for the day. So thanks for that as well, for completing that. And just a final thank you really to both Lucinda and Kimberly for chairing, because as chairs, they never really get the thanks. But thank you so much. That was, and particularly Lucinda, as it is your last meeting, which makes us all a bit sad. But I'm so glad you're staying on the executive committee. So thank you both for your chairing through the meeting as well. And thanks, Graham, as well, for facilitating us very skillfully. And making it so that I don't feel nearly as nervous on the morning of an AGM when I know that Graham is behind the wheel when it comes to keeping us all right and the technology. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you all soon again, I'm sure.